We ask the questions. What is needed in the world?
Bio je premijer i ministar vanjskih poslova Norveške. Od 2009. godine generalni sekretar Vijeća Europe i predsjednik Norveškog Nobelovog komiteta koji dodjeljuje nagrade za mir. Ekonomist po struci, objavio je 4 knjige. Gost emisije Recite Al Jazeeri je Thorbjorn Jagland. Mr. Jagland, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
You're heading the organization, the oldest European organization representing 47 countries, almost 800 million people. But the Council of Europe doesn't have the authority to make binding laws. So let's start with a question. Why do Europeans need the Council of Europe?
Well, we do not have the possibility to create binding laws, but there are binding obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights, and the fact that 800 million people can bring their case to the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg is, of course, a major achievement, not only in Europe, but for the whole world. So all the judgments from this court are binding for all the member states, and we have never seen such a thing in the history of the world.
Speaking of the Council of Europe, what would you call the greatest achievements, and what are the biggest challenges still lying ahead?
The greatest achievement is that we have created one legal space for the entire continent, which is the basis for unifying the continent even more politically and economically. The biggest challenge is that Europe is getting more and more diverse with regard to culture, religion, and also individual priorities that modern people do have today. So, and this diversity is, of course, a big advantage for the continent, but it is also a challenge. We can see growing xenophobic tendencies, even racism and violence, and this is, as I see it, the challenge for Europe today. The economic crisis will certainly be solved one day, but this challenge will not go away.
You mentioned economic crisis. Now with the recession and this financial crisis looming, many countries are taking on very strict austerity measures. Do you see in the future these austerity measures hurting the human rights in these countries and putting the human rights sort of at a secondary position during this crisis?
Absolutely. We have seen this before in Europe also, that when you have economic problems, rising unemployment, then you also get back the old problems on the continent. Xenophobic tendencies is rising. Violence against certain minorities is also increasing. And so I mean, I'm very concerned for what is going on in many countries now. And so therefore it's very important that Europe is able to tackle the economic problems. Otherwise, we can move even further into this negative spiral, which we have seen on the continent earlier also.
You have mentioned Europe as a continent with many different cultures, religions, nationalities living there. A few months ago, British Prime Minister David Cameron had a speech at the Council of Europe where he repeated his statement that the state's multiculturalism has failed. Do you agree with him?
Well, it depends on how you interpret what he said. I disagree if he means that we can move away from the situation that we have, namely that this is a continent of diversity. We cannot expel all those who come from the outside. As a matter of fact, Europe is totally dependent on all the immigrants. But he also said something very important, namely that when we have this situation with so many ethnic groups, so many religious groups, so many people with different cultural background. We shouldn't allow people to build what they call parallel societies, that we are living in isolated parallel societies and not interacting with each other. So if we allow this to continue, then of course multiculturalism has failed. But I disagree if the meaning is that this has already failed. But it may fail if we allow this kind of parallel societies growing inside the societies. I mean, what is very important is that, yes, we should pay respect to the fact, I mean, you have the right to keep your own identity, but we cannot be societies only with different identities. We have something that must hold us together, and that is the common values, actually, which is enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights, which everybody has to respect.
He also suggested that the European Court of Human Rights should reform, as he claims the court is increasingly meddling with the affairs of national governments, which is not only undermining the effectivity of the courts, but it is undermining the human rights in general. Are there any reforms of Court of Human Rights?
Well, I think what he said is an exaggeration. There may be some judgment from the court that could go in that direction. It is true, but this is not the main problem for the court. The main challenge from the court is that it has become so popular and that many member states do not have laws and judicial practices that are in line with the European Convention on Human Rights. Therefore, so many applications are coming to the court. This is the main problem.
He mentioned that as one of the problems. He said that that's why it has created the court as sort of a fourth instance. So now there is this really big backlog of unresolved cases. Is the court now the fourth instance?
To some extent, but this is also because what I said, namely that a number of countries do not have laws and judicial practices that are in compliance with the European Convention. So therefore people don't trust their own judicial system and they go to the court in Strasbourg. So, well, it is a problem, but again, we should speak about the facts relating to the court. And the fact is that the problems is not in the court, it is in the member states that are not upholding their obligations under the convention.
And is the court meddling in the affairs of national governments?
Well, you can probably mention some cases. I don't have anybody on my mind, but all in all, I would say no. The court is upholding the rights for every individual on the entire continent, and in particular for minorities. Human rights is very often for minorities, to upholding the right for minorities. And therefore, the judgment from such a court like we have in Strasbourg will very often be unpopular, because it is speaking about minorities and not about the rights of the majority. To upholding rights for minorities is not always popular.
At the heart of it, we could say that's this basic debate between universal human rights and sovereignty. Which prevails? It was said that the human rights always prevail over sovereignty if they are infringed. But what is universal human rights? Is it the same? Can it be the same for someone sitting in Strasbourg, sitting in London? Also for someone, let's say, in Moscow or Ankara or
yes,
here in Balkans?
Of course. Universal rights are defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN. And these rights are for all, Actually, these are natural rights. They are not coming from any authority or any law. They're coming from the fact that you are a human being. And you have these rights whether you live in Moscow or in Srebrenica or in Belgrade. So this is what the European Convention on Human Rights is about, namely that governments, they have an obligation to uphold these rights by law. The Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has an obligation to make judgments if the governments are not upholding these rights.
You have been quoted saying that there are human rights being infringed on in every single country of the Europe. What is the most dominant human rights problem in Europe?
It is very often excessive lengths of procedure in the courts. For instance, we have that problem in Italy. It is very often corruption, which means that you don't have an independent judiciary, which is a very, very serious problem. We have awful conditions in many prisons in Europe, for instance in France, Belgium, Russia. So that kind of problem, but the problems are different from country to country. So we cannot say that human rights problems are only in one part of Europe. We have some problems all over Europe.
Getting back to this region, you said for the Arab Spring countries that the stability there, the focus, the emphasis was for so long on stability at the expense of true reforms, and that's why the Arab Spring happened. In this region as well, the emphasis has been for a long time on stability. Would you say here it also happened at the expense of the requests for true reforms and human rights?
Yes. If you look at, for instance, this country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, it is clear that the Dayton Constitution was the only way to stop the war. And therefore, the Constitution gave special rights to the three people defined in the Dayton Constitution. But it didn't, so it stopped the war, but it didn't help building a nation. Because a nation must be much more than ethnic groups. There has to be something which is common for everybody. And that is what Bosnia and Herzegovina has to do now, namely to create a constitution that can create a modern state based on universal rights for everybody.
So it did happen, a similar situation here. The emphasis on stability came at the expense of reforms and human rights.
Well, not to the extent that we saw in the Arab world. The problem in the Arab world was and is that they didn't have freedom of expression, they didn't have autonomous institutions, and when you have that kind of situation, you always get corruption, you always get mismanagement of power, misuse of power, and at the end of the day you get revolution. I don't think you have that kind of situation on the Balkans today. But the problem, like you have here, when you don't have equal rights for everybody, and when you have veto power for certain ethnic groups, you are not able to develop the state and to provide population for social, economic rights. And in the long term, it will undermine the whole society.
How do you see media freedom in the Balkans? Are there any countries that you have that are troublesome in this regard?
There are still some. I mean, you have basic freedom of expression on the Balkans, all the countries on the Balkans. But of course, we would like to see a little bit more of pluralism in the media, in particular when it comes to television, which is the strongest media in today's world.
Is the media independent here?
Yes, I would say so.
And speaking of the progress that you mentioned, what can media outlets themselves do to improve their status, and what can states that the medias are located in do to help them improve their status?
Well, the basic obligations for the state is to secure the freedom of media and not interfere in their business. But it is also the other way around, namely that the media has to be entirely free from political authorities and report freely. The fact that Al Jazeera is here is a very good example. I mean, it's good that you have contributed to more pluralism in this country. I appreciate very much the work that Al Jazeera is not only doing here, but in many parts of the world, and you have added something very important to the international media picture.
I have also read your interesting statement regarding internet and the democracy. You said there is no country cannot be democratic if there is no freedom of internet access and freedom of expression on the internet.
That is true. Internet has become a very important tool in the democratic process, because you are able to spread your view rapidly and all over the world. But it is also very important to understand that the internet is not creating politics. It is a tool for spreading and discussion, but still you need to safeguard that you have a dialogue around the tables where people can look at each other and have a real dialogue. So if these things can go hand in hand and interact with each other, I think it will strengthen democracy a lot.
The next part of the interview will devote as your other role as the chairman of the Norwegian Nobel Committee. You're in charge of Nobel Peace Prize, and each year you receive hundreds of valid nominations. So on which grounds do you select recipient?
Well, that is on the basis of the will of Alfred Nobel, that wrote in this will that the prize should go to the person that had done most for brotherhood between people, for, in today's wording, disarmament, and for peaceful resolution of conflicts. So these are the three criteria that we are looking on every year.
So is it hopes, expectations, or real achievements?
It can be both. From time to time we are awarding a person or an organization that has worked through the years and achieved results. Other years we have awarded people that are creating hope, great expectations, and trying to move the world in the right direction. For instance, when we gave the prize to President Obama, it was because he changed very much of the US policy away from unilateralism towards multilateralism, talking about dialogue, and moving the world away from confrontation towards more cooperation and dialogue.
That particular award raised a lot of eyebrows and a lot of dust, because President Obama was nominated only 12 days after he entered the Oval Office, so he didn't have time to achieve anything, and he was chosen for his, as it says, extraordinary efforts to strengthen international diplomacy and cooperation between peoples. 3 years on, would you say that he accomplished these things you hoped for him to accomplish?
A lot of very positive things have happened because he embarked upon this new approach. For instance, before he came, there was no negotiations between the United States and Russia on nuclear disarmament because of the American proposal to set up this nuclear shield over Europe. Obama said that we have to negotiate with Russians also on this nuclear shield, and therefore it paved the way for negotiations, and we have a start agreement about strategic nuclear weapons, which actually rescued the whole global nuclear disarmament mechanism. Without that, it would have been dead. So only that was sufficient to give the Nobel Prize to him. So he created a completely new atmosphere which paved the way for negotiations. And I mean, we couldn't avoid to give it to him only for that.
He got it before he achieved anything on
no,
the basis
he said
promise.
He was nominated because he said this, that I want to negotiate with the Russians also about this nuclear shield. So it was a major effort to create a dialogue with the Russians. And I mean, we couldn't avoid to give the prize to him for this.
So it was not a politically motivated decision, as some critics said that year.
No, but we are not part of that crazy political conflict that many media and politicians are always enhancing. We are not part of that. We are looking to the facts. And the fact was that before Obama came, there were confrontations in the world on all fronts. No negotiations. No dialogue between Russia and the United States on nuclear disarmament. And he actually, in a very short time, he created the climate for dialogue, for negotiations on nuclear armaments. So these are the facts and not this crazy political conflict that everybody wants to enhance and uphold.
In 2010, Liu Jiabao, a Chinese writer and human rights activist and a prisoner, got a Nobel Peace Prize. And again, there were criticism because it created some problems for his family and other human rights activists in China. However, looking back, Burma's Aung San Suu Kyi in 1991, when she received the award, she was in similar situation. And now we see her enter the parliament as a part of the opposition. Do you see something like that happening with Liu Jiabao and in China?
It may happen, but Aung San Suu Kyi is a very good example that what can be seen as wrong at a time proves to be very important and a wise decision 20 years after. I mean, you can say the same about Andrei Sakharov in Soviet Union at the time. He also got the prize, and now he is one of the most respected men in Russia. So I believe that that Liu Xiaobo can be regarded in the same way 20 years ahead. But I mean, human rights is not only a pleasant thing. Somebody has to fight for it under very difficult circumstances, which Andrei Sakharov did, which Aung San Suu Kyi did, which Nelson Mandela did. And we have time and again avoided that kind of people that paved the way for human rights and democracy. And look what is happening in the Arab world. So the lack of human rights is the root cause for what we are witnessing now.
And were they ever wrong decisions as to now looking back?
Yes, but it is not up to me to judge. I have not been the chairman of the committee for, I mean, during all these years. But of course, I mean, many prizes can be disputed. And but I would say that the most important prizes, the prizes that have had most impact in the world, are the one that was most disputed and criticized. For instance, the prize that we gave to Karl von Ossietzky before the war. He was in a concentration camp and died there. was criticized heavily all over Europe. But today, what shall we say? And the prize to Nelson Mandela, to Willy Brandt, for instance, was heavily criticized for his opening up to the East. So all the, I mean, the most debated and disputed and criticized prizes have proved to be the most important one.
So how would you describe the true importance of the Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, it has some impact in the world. I do not want to overestimate it, but we are setting the agenda. Without the Nobel Peace Prize, I don't think that Aung San Suu Kyi would have been so famous and such an important symbol for people in Burma, but also all over the world. I think that Tawakkul Karman from Yemen has already become a symbol for many young people all over the Arab world. So we are, in a way, contributing to setting the agenda.
And giving role models to the oppressed?
Yes.
For someone from this region to get the Nobel Peace Prize, what do they have to do?
Create peace. Solve the problems. So the remaining problems on this part of Europe.
Mr. Jagland, thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.
We ask the question, what is needed in the world?